When you're driven, the need to accomplish a goal is relentless. Hard work and ambition compel you to do whatever's necessary. In my work as a personal injury trial lawyer for 18 years, it's common to meet driven people. Those with drive can have different personalities, careers, or backgrounds, but they possess one common factor. Despite their passions, driven people want to surround and motivate themselves with other driven people. If you want to learn how to overcome obstacles by learning from others, then tune in here. This is the Driven Crowd Podcast. Thank you for tuning into episode 8 of the Driven Crowd Podcast, fueled by Snelling's Law. I'm your host, Scott Snellings. Today, we're going to be speaking with a very unique individual. He's a partner at Weaver Johnston Nelson, where his law practice focuses on the healthcare industry as well as the cannabis industry. He's also a board member of the Texas Cannabis Council and an adjunct professor at the University of North Texas School of Law. Richard Cheng, welcome to the Driven Crowd Podcast.
Hey, Scott. How's it going?
Doing good, man. Doing good. Thank you for being here today.
No, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Now, tell me this. Are you one of those lawyers who grew up always wanting to be a lawyer, or did you kind of fall into it like I did later in life?
Completely fell into it. I don't know how you grew up, Scott, but I didn't, we grew up in an area that wasn't all that affluent. Obviously, coming from immigrant family household, you're just not taught to be a lawyer, right? There really weren't that many lawyers around. In fact, there's actually, some history between my dad and I, him telling me not to go to law school.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, his exact words were, "Don't bother going to law school. You'll never get a client."
That's confidence inspiring from your own father right there. Well, so why did he say that? Why did he say that you were never going to get a client?
If you want me to be transparent, he said that because I was Asian.
Okay.
Yeah, he says, and in fact, I remember when I was really young, he said, when all things being the same, no person would hire an Asian attorney.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Where do you think that insight came from?
He grew, when he moved to the U.S., it was, back in the 70s, and, living in a lot of small towns, like we lived in Cookeville, Tennessee, or Hopkinsville, Kentucky. So I think throughout his path and his journey, right, he probably encountered a few things that might have, I would say, influenced his way of thought or, his perspective on things. And I think he just saw practice of law, which if you think about it, to a degree, it is kind of true. It is somewhat still of a good old boys network, right?
Sure, absolutely.
Depending on where you are. And, different geographical areas have different impacts, but
as well as practice areas.
As well as practice areas, that's correct. And so I think in his mind, it was just, if everything being the same, why would someone hire you being the way you are versus someone that fits the mold, right? That fits the mold better.
Okay. Well, so you hear that from your dad growing up. About how old are you when this is going on? Or is this just kind of, you grew up with this type of mindset?
I want to say it was as early as probably like my early teens, because I think it was one time I expressed an interest in going to law school, but it was just one of those very casual conversations, and something very casually came up in conversation. And he just said, don't even think about it, son. There's no chance in you being a lawyer. I said, well, why not? He says, well, because even if you became a lawyer, you'll never get a client. So if you can't get a client, there's no point in pursuing that path.
Okay. And so hearing that kind of in your early teens, did you let that sink in? Did you say, okay, yeah, Dad's probably right. He's right about most things. Or did you immediately kind of repel that advice?
It's an interesting question because, growing up, I've been always somewhat rebellious. And so the part of me was always trying to prove people wrong, whether it's parents or cousins or different people in my life. And, I still find that to be the case today. So, and then another part of me, if you think about it, growing up as a kid in the household, if you're told that, you're going to be influenced to some degree.
Sure.
And so I think that's part of the reason why I put law school on hold and I pursued a more, quote, traditional path, which I guess I fit the mold better, which going to law school was a career change for me.
Okay.
So I pursued a different path, and after about 4 years, or really about 3 years, I started having thoughts about law school. And at that point, it was more like, okay, I'm making my own money now. I'm 25. It doesn't really matter what Dad said, when you're 12 or whatever, 13, however old I was. I think I want to take a stab at it. Maybe I'll be no good. Who knows? But I certainly didn't want to not pursue it and then be 45 or however old I was thinking at the time, in my mind being old at the time, right? Which
you are now.
Which I am now. And have regrets. I think that's one of the things that I fear most, is having regrets.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right. So the career that you did end up going into before law school, what was that?
So I was an occupational therapist.
Really?
Yeah, for about 4 years before I went to law school in 2003. So I was an OT from 99 to 2003. I was an OT. Worked full time, and then obviously, as you know, first year of law school is very hectic. I didn't really bother about I didn't really worry about working. I just wanted to get through school, and then by my second year, I would work on the weekends as an OT, and then during the day, I would work at a law firm.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. Well, and so you kind of had this, at least early on, kind of an inclination, maybe I'll go to law school.
Yeah.
And then eventually you end up at a point where you do go. So what was it about law school or the law in general that stuck with you? What made you want to take a harder look and eventually go down that route?
Sure. I think there were a number of different events in my life that led me there. One in particular, which I won't elaborate too much, was really where a lawyer who is, unfortunately, he's passed now, which I never got a chance to thank him, but there was a certain event in my life that a lawyer actually, I'll even go as far as saving my life.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was pretty impactful. The events that were associated with that, it could have led to my death. And what transpired thereafter required a lawyer, and it was a lawyer out of Lubbock, and again, since then he's passed. I actually just found out that he passed about 2 years ago, and I've always wanted to thank him, and I've always wanted to say, hey, I became a lawyer, and it was partly influenced by you, but beyond that, it's funny, we keep going back to my dad, but growing up, he operated restaurants. And, when I was about 14, there was a period of time he kept on getting notices from the health department, a violation here, a violation there.
Sure.
And he didn't want to deal with it. He thought he can just hand it to me. He's like, oh, go figure it out. And
he handed them to you.
Yeah, he would hand them to me, and which is kind of ironic, right? Because
don't be a lawyer, but be my lawyer.
Right. Don't be a lawyer, but go problem solve these issues.
These legal issues.
These legal issues with local municipality regulations. And I would call in, and I was just really doing what he asked me to do for him.
Sure.
I would call in. And me being 15 years old, you really don't know what you're doing, right?
No.
You're just trying to, you don't even know, you can't even drive. And I think it was on the third violation. Because I remember there were four. For whatever reason, I remember there were four. But there was one in particular. I think it was the third one. And I read it, and I thought, well, this doesn't really apply. And I actually took the time and actually looked up the regulation they used for the violation. I'm like, well, how does that apply? Because the facts are all wrong. I think they can be completely misquoted, the facts, and I think I don't understand how it would apply to law. So I called in, and I kind of argued with the person over the phone. I said, well, I don't understand how this would apply because this isn't the case. And whatever I did, they dismissed it. So I guess in some ways I got my first victory at 14 years old with the local health department.
Hey, that's a victory.
Yeah, and so that kind of stuck in my mind. And of course, throughout the years, I always had it in the back of my mind, but there wasn't really like a driving force behind it. And then I think it was a combination of different events in my life, and of course what I talked about earlier. And I think one day somebody just said, "Oh, you should potentially go to law school because." With your healthcare background, maybe you can make a living doing that.
All right, so most people when they go to law school, they don't say, "I want to go be a healthcare lawyer."
Yeah,
right?
they don't.
I think the first time I met you and you told me that you were a healthcare lawyer, I was like, "What exactly does that mean?"
Yeah.
And so I guess start off by telling us, what does a healthcare lawyer do?
Sure. Well, so there's, people interpret the term healthcare lawyer in different ways. When you say the term healthcare lawyer, I think many people think of medical malpractice as a default, right? They're like, oh, well, you represent doctors because when they get in trouble. Well, no, I don't actually do any litigation at all, as you know. And so what I do, at least, is I advise on state and federal regulations as it pertains to the operations and the transactional aspect of the healthcare industry. So when private equity groups or investors or physicians or different types of people in the industry, they want to go and buy a business or sell a business or operate a particular healthcare business, there are different regulations, in both state and federal and local, that they have to abide by, and sometimes different types of healthcare arrangements that could trigger some of those laws. And again, it's a highly regulated industry, right? So when those laws are indeed affected, it could mean a lot of money and sometimes even jail time. So a lot of what I do is advise on healthcare regulatory issues and compliance, usually in the course of a corporate transaction or something that's related to operations.
Okay. And so I guess in that aspect of your life, you were dealing with kind of bigger business owners, smaller business owners, maybe that are trying to get together with other business owners to build buildings or form practices, things like that. In your experience, what have you seen at that level that differentiates those that do succeed in starting and growing their business from those that really struggle?
One, I think the ones that really struggle, they jump into it without having a very defined plan of what they want. Okay. Sometimes the ones that struggle may not foresee a lot of different events down the road, or they may not even expect it to be as complicated as it is. It could be just poor business judgment, poor business planning, being undercapitalized, not having the right management team involved. There's an entire host of different issues. Many of the ones that have succeeded, they've failed many times in the past, and they've learned over time that, oh, you can't do that, or I need a different management team, or, oh, those are laws that could actually put me in jail, right? Or those are laws that I actually have to abide by. Oh, or it would actually be wise to go get a CPA that knows about Medicare issues, or how to properly structure your tax planning for the business, or it's I should probably get a healthcare attorney to advise me on X, Y, and Z. I think the ones that really succeed, they have a good vision and they're good on execution, and they're really good about follow through.
And I think that is a huge, absolutely huge point that you just made right there. There's a lot of visionaries out there that really do have amazing ideas, and if they could find someone either to push them or to come alongside them and help them actually execute those ideas, then they could be world changers.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, a lot of the idea people out there don't have that person in their life, or just can't make themselves do it,
right?
Or they just sit there and come up with more and more ideas. Right? They never sit there and actually focus on one of the ones that they come up with, which is one of the things I admire about you. Is you're a very creative guy, and you have your hands in all kinds of different pots, right? Yeah. So let's move into the cannabis industry.
Okay, sure.
Speaking of being creative, it's obviously a relatively new legal industry.
Yep.
And so as that is growing, right? Because the inception of
no pun intended.
Exactly. As that's growing, as that's growing, you're having to kind of be on the forefront of helping draft regulations, of advising people on these regulations that are out there and where you think they're going to go.
Sure.
So how do you approach that?
Well, I mean, initially it was a lot of figuring out, right? I mean,
Sure.
I got into it back in late 2013.
Okay.
The mini story behind that was, so before I came back out into private practice in late 2013, I was in-house counsel for 2 different healthcare companies.
Okay.
Right? So historically, I've always been in healthcare. And so during my time as in-house counsel, I was taking courses to earn a graduate certificate in public health at UT Health Sciences Center. My graduating, I guess you can call it like a graduating thesis for my program, I did on the legalization of cannabinoid-based products. It was really just a school project. I just needed a grade and graduate, right?
Yeah, this is somewhat interesting. I'll write on this.
Yeah, and well, the terms of the project was pretend you're proposing to pass a law in the state legislature on an issue that's never been passed before. And I thought, well, what am I going to do it on, right? And so, long story short, I decided to do it. I'm like, well, Texas will never pass anything like this, so this is perfect. And I did it, and I kind of got fascinated with it because I was forced to do the research into it, and thought I did it. Never thought I would ever touch it again. Just kind of did it, got a good grade, and just finished the program. About a month later, I joined a national law firm that was based out in New York. They had launched a Dallas office here, and I was one of the attorneys that helped launch that office. And I got a call from New York. They said, "Hey, healthcare guy, maybe you can help us figure this out. Our new client wants to know the physician liabilities prescribing versus recommending medical marijuana." I was the closest thing that they had to a healthcare attorney. And so I took on that client, and I took on that project, and I figured it out. And I would say about 9 or 10 months later, I met my first cannabis client, who will eventually become my first cannabis client later on. And we met, got to know each other, and around the same time that he engaged me to do some work for his cannabis company, I was offered to become the outside general counsel for the Texas Cannabis Industry Association. And through that, as you can imagine, being exposed to different members, that kind of was kind of a point where it kind of took off.
Sure.
Represented one of the cannabis companies to apply for the Texas Compassionate Use Program for the licensure. Now, granted, they didn't get it, but it was nevertheless a learning process. Joined a national firm that, at the time, one of the few national firms that had a national cannabis practice, and the chair of that program in another state, he just said, "I'm so overwhelmed with state licensing. Can you do pretty much everything else?" And that gave me an opportunity to cut my teeth across the country doing different projects. And 9 years in, here I am, right? And so I'm still doing it. And when I got into it, it was very challenging, as you can probably imagine.
Absolutely.
Back in 2013 in Texas, right? So there were a lot of people that questioned why I was getting into it. Really, I mean, some people even thought I was a pothead, which is funny because I don't even smoke cigarettes. So
the straight-laced guy is the cannabis
I'm like,
lawyer.
He must be a pothead, so that's why he's doing it. Or, why is he even wasting his time? So there was a lot of scrutiny behind it. And but along the way, there were obviously, as you can imagine, being in a law firm, there was there was a lot of political navigation that you had to navigate through.
Yeah, well, and that's one of the things I wanted to ask you about is, I guess, how did you deal with those perceptions? Did you actually discuss it with partners, or did you wait for them to come to you? And then same thing for the stereotype, if you will, of when people hear that you're a cannabis lawyer, they think, oh, probably some party boy who just happened to get his law degree so that he could go figure out a way to smoke pot legally.
Well, I think what helped me was that before I got into the cannabis industry, I was already doing something else, which for the most part, most cannabis attorneys, how they fell into cannabis, they were already doing something else. Unless you talk to, some of the attorneys I know that got into it in the mid 90s, right? Around 96, 97, that was like the beginning part of really getting into the legal issues with dealing with cannabis. But that was, again, out on the West Coast.
Gotcha.
Most cannabis, what we call cannabis attorneys, they usually come from other industries, gaming, alcohol, IP is a big one, or many times it's criminal. So I came into the cannabis industry through another highly regulated industry. To me, it just made sense because I was already dealing with a lot of state and federal based regulations. Cannabis is heavily regulated, both state and federal, many times in the same way. And so, that kind of helped me because I was coming in from a legitimate industry, right?
Okay.
That had some history behind it, that being healthcare. And then, of course, when you get into it, that's when people who are less familiar with you, they start scrutinizing, saying, "Well, why is he in it? Or what is he doing? What is this cannabis stuff?" And of course, different attorneys from different generations will have a different perception. I would say generally, when I first got into it, attorneys that were, I would just say, 65 and up, they thought it was a joke. They thought, this is an absolute joke. He's crazy for even entertaining it. And then there was the crowd that was the in between, and there were some supporters thinking, "Oh, that's really cool. It's pretty innovative, and that's kind of cutting edge, but it'll never really go anywhere."
Sure.
Right. It was kind of a mixed message, and so there were some challenges convincing partners like this is a legitimate practice, or convincing people that you can make a living doing this. And even other issues that that I don't usually talk about, like I'll just even say insurance. There was a time where I was at a firm and they actually had to go out and get new coverage because of me. Or
really?
They had a hard time
malpractice coverage?
Yeah.
Okay.
And even my firm now, we had to go out to market to find a particular policy that specifically covered this area because not every insurance company is going to cover it.
Well, it's not well established.
That's
You're kind of flying by the seat of your pants in pretty much everything you do, I would imagine.
Well, now it's becoming more and more established. Now that I'm 9 years in, and you hear more about it in the news, in the papers, magazines. So people are, insurance companies and different industries have come around a little bit more. Now, granted, it's still the legal status of cannabis varies from state to state, and even on a federal level to different degrees. Whether you're dealing with hemp or medical marijuana or recreational, so it's definitely made progress, but it's still at the same time it can still be a challenge.
So what do you see in terms of similarities between when you got into the cannabis space and what the lawyers are trying to do right now in crypto and metaverse and kind of these new frontiers for the law?
Everybody, with new developing practice areas like crypto or like blockchain, AI, those are all very, very cool industries to get into. I know a number of attorneys that get into gaming. There's now gaming law, right? Because gaming has become such a big thing now. I think what differentiates cannabis from all those different industries is marijuana is illegal. So it's a federal crime to take marijuana across state lines.
There's that, Richard. But
there's that, right? and so you don't have that challenge with crypto. You don't have that challenge with AI. You don't have that challenge with blockchain. One developing area that I'm starting to get more and more involved with is dealing with psilocybin, aka magic mushrooms.
Okay.
Now that is another, I would say, parallel to cannabis. How I differentiated is that cannabis had more challenges in some ways because of its historical past.
Right.
Okay. With cannabis, there was a lot of history behind it. You had a lot of political challenges. Everything starting from the 1910s all the way through the 30s, 40s. up until 1971 when the Controlled Substances Act was passed, and everything in between. And there were movies like Reefer Madness,
Reefer
right?
Madness.
Yeah, and there were some racial issues, some racial tension issues, and there were some issues how we even got the word marijuana associated with Mexican migrant workers. Psilocybin doesn't have that. Magic mushrooms, psilocybin, they don't have that history behind it. So in some ways, I don't think it's as much of a challenge. I'll give you an example. In 2021, in Texas, we already passed a psilocybin research bill. It was passed within how long? Within a couple years. It took how long to even consider a medical marijuana program here? And even now, it's still somewhat limited. It passed in 2015 with one qualifying condition. After 7 years, we only have 8. So, it's starting to develop more and more. And ever since PTSD was added as a qualifying condition last year, you did see a spike in the number of physicians that were enrolled into the program, and you did see an increase in enrollment into the program.
And it's interesting that you mentioned that too, because you have a lot of personalities. Tim Ferriss, I think, is kind of a leading example of that, who are really pushing the research of this. It's not pushing it for recreational use per se, but pushing it towards, hey, look, we have a lot of people out here with some mental and emotional issues that this really seems like it could benefit. Mm-hmm. And so let's really push this research out there and see, hey, how can we harness the power for this to help these people get through PTSD, to help our veterans, to help all of those others.
And PTSD isn't even limited to the military, right?
Oh,
I mean,
for sure.
You and I could have PTSD right now.
We have clients all the time that have PTSD.
Yeah.
So, interesting. Okay. So, UNT, you are an adjunct professor.
Adjunct, yes.
How did you fall into that?
I had adjunct taught before in the past.
Okay.
At a number of universities. I was provided with an opportunity to adjunct teach back in 2006, online teaching, I want to say advanced healthcare public policy. And over the years, I had developed that class. And when there was a stint where I taught at St. Catherine's University, which is you're gonna laugh. It's the largest all-females Catholic college.
And you just happened to end up there.
I just happened to end up teaching there, yeah. And then taught at Rocky Mountain University as an adjunct as well. Again, mostly healthcare public policy. And so I want to say it was January of 2020. It was January of 2020, right before the pandemic. Sure. I got a call from UNT, and they said, hey, one of the students dropped your name, and he said that it would be great if UNT Law School had a cannabis class. There's only one other law school program in Texas that has a cannabis class, and it's at Texas A&M. So they wanted one, and so they called me and said, hey, would you consider developing a course? And I agreed, and so I developed the course, taught it in the fall of 2020, and they gave me a call back and said, hey, do you mind teaching it again in the fall again of 2021? So I taught it again last fall. Yeah.
So you've taught at several different universities. We always preach in our office that you don't know it until you teach it, right?
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that we do is we got to learn all different kinds of things and get it to a level where we can teach it. What are some of your biggest takeaways, both as a student, as a professor, and from your students that you've pulled from being a professor?
I always say this, I learn as much from the students as they learn from me, maybe even more sometimes. It's amazing the wealth of knowledge in your student base, especially in a nascent industry like cannabis, right? Mm-hmm. Is that there are actual business experts in your class that's taking your course. And they may not be lawyers, they may not be legal experts at that stage in their life, but they have a lot of information they can share. That makes, I think, the learning experience very rich.
That's fantastic. Have you found that at most universities, or just when you're teaching at kind of the law school level?
I want to say it has been different. the very first course I taught, first of all, I was a very inexperienced instructor at the time. It was much younger, right? It was, it was in 2006, so that was 16 years ago. So I obviously just by nature of time and just amount of knowledge, I had less knowledge then. So then there were, and quite frankly, at that time, it was a graduate doctorate program for occupational therapy school. And I was teaching public policy. Of course, their expertise was on the clinical aspects, and they had to take my class to get through the program, right?
Your requirements.
Yeah, and so I was a requirement. But most of my students were older than me because it was a graduate program. Now, the one at St. Kate's, it was a very different experience. It was a very vibrant experience. It was a very lively experience. Many of the students were either my age or younger, and so it was just a different flavor. I learned from them just as much as they learned from me, hopefully, but in a different way.
Sure.
And then, of course, teaching law school, the law school environment is very different than, say, in a clinical program.
Okay.
So,
you mentioned earlier when talking about kind of the characteristics of the successful business owners versus those who struggle.
Yeah.
Talking about goal setting. What does that look like for you? How do you go about saying, all right, I'm going to lay out goals. Here's how I'm going to do it. Here's what I'm looking at. Here's how I measure my progress.
I think that varies depending on what goal you're trying to set and what you want to do. For example, to be a better lawyer, that's what we call it, the practice of law, right?
Sure.
It's substantive, and it's about acquiring knowledge, implementing knowledge, and keep practicing. It's an ongoing practice. If we're looking at business development, that takes on a different set of skills, and how you build that, and your goals for that may be very different, and how you approach it may be very different. So I don't know if there's a magic sauce for everything, but for me, it's really about me finding ways to improve and to be better every day, even if it's incremental, even if it's just an ounce better. Maybe it's learning how to do something more effective or more efficient. Maybe it's developing new relationships, right? And so because none of us are an island. We all rely on other people to help us get to where we are.
Sure.
We're a community. But for me, it's really about being the best version that I can be for myself. I can't. There's only so many things I can control. If I can be the best version of me, then that's a good start. Now, as far as finding different thresholds and different goal points, it's setting those small goals. Sometimes those short-term and small goals can lead to bigger goals, because once you have momentum, you can do a lot with momentum.
The big mo.
Yeah. So I'm a big believer in developing momentum. And once you have the momentum, it propels you, or it helps you be motivated for that next project, because that initial there's inertia, right? And to get things started, it takes a lot more effort and time. But once you get going, you're already in that frame of mind.
Gotcha. You can't lose 20 pounds before you lose 1, right?
That's right. Yeah. Sometimes I wish I can jump to 20 pounds versus just that.
Many of us wish that. Yeah, you figured that out, and we're in business.
That's right.
So in terms of becoming your best self, what types of things do you do to grow?
For me, it's finding ways to learn, to learn new concepts, to stay healthy. Okay, so I'm a big believer in waking up early. For people who know me, I get up at 4:30 in the morning.
All right.
I get up at 4:30 in the morning. I start, I start looking at my schedule. I may reply a few emails, and I hit the gym. And after that, then they get started. And so again, that's building that momentum. And so for me, it's as a lawyer, again, it's acquiring knowledge, it's implementing knowledge, it's developing that practice, it's developing my business. Coming up with new creative ideas on how to how to be a better business person, because at the end of the day, I run a business for myself, no different than you.
Right.
I'm looking at some other ideas that's outside of law, and sometimes that can be really fun because there's other things I want to do besides practicing law, and talking to the people that I need to talk to, doing my own research and finding out how to be, whether it's something that I want to engage in. But at the same time, outside of that, it's important to develop yourself as an individual too, making sure that everything's balanced in your life. Making sure that your kids are healthy, your relationships with other people in your life are healthy, and find time to also foster growth in other people, whether it's mentorship or whether it's giving back in a different way. So, for example, I developed a new business. It was never meant to be profitable. It was never meant to be anything grand, but it was developed to serve as a resource center for single dads back in October of last year. And that was my way of giving back. No different than adjunct teaching, right? I don't do it for the money. So, I mean, in fact, I always, if anything, if you look at the time, you kind of lose money. But
sure,
I enjoy it because I am helping that next generation of attorneys, foster their growth.
Well, tell us a little bit about your dad's program. What's it called, and where can people find out more about it?
Yeah, so I was actually just telling somebody about it this morning because they asked. It was an idea I came up with back in 2018. I was actually out of town, and I heard the story. It was really like a friend of a friend that I heard about this single dad that was afraid to challenge his parental rights or to really exercise his parental rights because there was something going on in his life to where either he was getting his time reduced with his kids or something negative was happening. And I overheard that conversation and I asked, I said, well, why didn't he challenge it? And the response I got was that he was afraid to because he thought if he did, something worse may happen. He may end up with a worse deal than versus if he just left it alone. And I thought, well, that's not right. There's something very unsettling about that, right? So what I realized over time and started looking into different things and started talking to different people, talking to other single dads, talking to people who have been divorced, doing some online research about how much resources are out there for single dads. You know what I found? Zero. There really aren't that many resources, if anything at all. And so I thought, well, single dads are they're an interesting demographic. I'll explain why. Because historically speaking, and of course it's evolved over time. I think overall dads have become more involved in the nurturing of their kids over time. But of course, I don't think that's always been the case. But so historically, at least from the outside perception, is that dads kind of get a raw deal in court and kind of get a raw deal when it comes to time with their kids or being a co-parent, having equal rights to their kids. Okay, but I thought that's interesting because in split household situations, women have resources out in the community, whether it's Hope Door or whatever. Kids have different resources. Not to say we couldn't have more. We can always have more.
Sure.
But then there's a disproportionate impact if you compare it to single men. There are almost zero resources out there. How many resources do you know out there for single men? Almost none. But at the same time, society has held single dads and men to a very high standard. And what I mean by that is if you are not involved with your kid's life, if you're not paying your child support, if you're not being a good role model and meeting all your expectations, you're quote, a deadbeat dad, or at least it's the label. And so my struggle with that is, how is it that there are all these expectations, but society and our community gives these single dads almost no resources to achieve those goals? So essentially, in some ways, single dads are set up to fail from the very beginning. And I've actually talked to a district court judge about this. And I told her about that story I initially told you, how I developed this idea. And I just said to her, I said, I'm sorry, but to many single dads, I can't say for myself, but I'm not saying this for myself, but I can tell you from after talking to many single dads, they see the judicial process as being very unfairly unfavorable to them. And this is why. And I explained it. So that was really the genesis of creating this resource center. And what I wanted to do was I wanted to create a resource center that offered like a men's support group for single dads, and also a resource center to provide them with information, whether it's for financial planning, because when you split up, you have half the assets, right? When you go through split household situations, you may need a lawyer. Provide information for a family law attorney or family law attorneys, counseling. So it was really aimed at providing a resource where single dads could come and help each other share experiences to provide essentially ongoing guidance and ongoing support. Because there really aren't any. Even if you go online and do your research right now, there really are zero resources. So I created Dads at Peace. So the company's called Dads at Peace, and from November through, I would say, March of this year, I've had monthly meetings, and people will come anywhere between, I would say on average, between 5 to 7 people will show up, and I feed them. And essentially, it lasts for about an hour and a half, sometimes 2 hours. And I won't name any names, but
sure.
For example, one person shows up on a regular basis and he cries every single time. For every one of him, there's probably 10 others that are just like him that probably can need that, that can benefit from that. And so that's the culture of the Dads at Peace that I created.
All right. Where can people find out more about that if they're interested in getting some of those resources or passing them along?
Sure.
No, where can they find it?
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
There's a Facebook page, the Dads at Peace Facebook page, and a website is in the works right now.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah.
You're a busy guy. You've got Dads at Peace. You are an adjunct professor. You've got a law firm. You're doing all kinds of other stuff in the cannabis industry. How do you manage your time?
Oh, that's tough.
Obviously you get up at 4:30, so you get a head start.
Yeah.
But there's only so many hours in the day, and even you have to sleep. So how do you handle that?
You really have to be very disciplined. You have to be extremely disciplined. I can say this. There's not a whole lot of time for personal activities. You do have to make a lot of sacrifices, but I think part of time management is just identifying priorities and understanding what needs to be done in the immediate future versus long-term future, and not be overwhelmed with that, and balancing the two.
Which kind of goes to goals. So when you're looking at your long-term future, you say, all right, here's what I want to accomplish, but here's what I have to accomplish right now. Mm-hmm. How do you move towards accomplishing the long-term goals if you're constantly stuck in the, man, I'm so busy, I have so many commitments, I've got to get these things done, but I really want to move down the field towards these bigger goals?
Sometimes you delegate. Sometimes you get additional help, obviously. Sometimes you have to put things off until you're in a better position to do it. Okay, so putting that aside, to answer your question about addressing long-term goals, again, it goes back to you have to make time for it. If you don't make time for it, then you're never going to address it. I have a couple of long-term goals sitting on my desk right now that I haven't gotten to in 6 months, right? But is it imminent? It's probably not imminent. It's not going to affect my life anytime soon, but they are long-term goals, and they are things I want to get done within the next year. And you make incremental progress towards it when you can, but at the same time, you do have to set weekends aside, right? Or you may have to set aside and sacrifice not going to a specific event. You may not be on certain weekends. I may not get as much, lounge and personal time. So the weekends for me It may not be true weekends sometimes.
You're just not bothered by as much email, right?
That's right. Yeah. So, you do the best you can, and you do have to be disciplined, and you do have to make that that initial effort to work towards it.
So you start off with a great word, delegate. One of the books that changed my life once I read it was Who Not How, by Hardy and Dan Sullivan, Benjamin Hardy and Dan Sullivan. Fantastic book, game changer for me. So anybody listening who either hates delegating or doesn't delegate or doesn't think they need to delegate, read that book. It's a super quick read and it'll change your life. So when you are putting together your personal vision, right? Here's where I want to be in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. What are you looking at? What facets of your life have priority in that vision?
I think about what I want to do in the immediate future. What's going to make me, what's going to fill that cup of me feeling challenged, right? Sometimes it's for financial reasons, right?
Sure.
There's nothing wrong with that. And sometimes it's because, sometimes I prioritize just me having more flexibility, me having more freedom. So I consider a lot of different things. It's really a combination of what's good for me long-term, what's good for me short-term in the immediate future, what's good for my family. What is it that I really want to do long-term that makes me happy? That fills that cup of, hey, I'm really happy doing this, but is it at the same time, is it challenging, or am I going to get bored with it? So I think there are a lot of different factors that go into that.
It's amazing how easier it is to be disciplined and to keep momentum when you're enjoying and fulfilled by what it is that you're doing. Once again, go read Who Not How, and it points to that as well. All right, we are almost out of town, out of time. Just got back in town, almost out of time. Let's go through a couple of quick questions. Yep. Favorite book?
The Summons.
Summons.
Yes, because I'm reading that right now.
All right.
Yeah, I love it. I take that back. I did one of my favorite books. I take that back. Probably my favorite book is Count of Monte Cristo.
Oh, fantastic book.
Oh, that was such a good book.
He was in jail for cannabis, right?
No, I don't think he was in jail for cannabis.
Okay. All right. Maybe I'm misremembering. What about business books?
There is a book. It's called, it's actually a pretty old one. It's Think and Grow Rich, or
Napoleon Hill.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Are you a podcast guy? Do you listen to podcasts?
I am.
All right.
I am.
What are your top few podcasts?
But I don't have like a regular podcast that I regularly go to. But if there is one, and the title strikes an interest, I'll listen to it. But as far as like a dedicated podcast that I always go to, I don't think I have one. I do listen to a lot of Joe Rogan.
Okay. All right. So you're a Joe Rogan guy.
Yeah.
And what are you watching right now?
The Lincoln Lawyer. I just started it last night on Netflix.
That was a great movie. I've not seen any part of the series yet.
The series is great.
All right,
I'm on episode 3 right now.
Okay. I'll have to put that on my list. Yeah. All right. Thank you so much. What are some social media handles where people can go find you online?
I'm on LinkedIn. So, and obviously I am also, pretty much LinkedIn. I do have a Twitter account, but I don't really use it. So it's mostly LinkedIn.
Fantastic. All right. Thank you so much for being here. I really enjoyed it, Richard, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Hey, thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Absolutely.